In the summer of 1942, deep within the scorching steppes of southern Russia, a decision was made that would seal the fate of an empire. Adolf Hitler, drunk on years of conquest and convinced of his own strategic genius, ordered his armies toward a city that bore the name of his greatest enemy. That city was Stalingrad, and what began as another calculated strike in the Nazi war machine would become the bloodiest urban nightmare in human history. The story of how this single battle shattered the myth of German invincibility and turned the tide of the entire Second World War. The year 1942 had dawned with the Third Reich stretching from the Atlantic shores of France to the frozen wastes of the Russian front. Hitler's armies had conquered most of Europe in a series of lightning campaigns that left the world stunned. Poland had fallen in weeks, France in mere months, and now the Wehrmacht stood poised to deliver what many believed would be the final blow to the Soviet Union. Yet beneath this veneer of unstoppable momentum lay the seeds of disaster, planted by one man's obsession with a city he had never seen. By spring 1942, Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's grand invasion of the Soviet Union, had stalled short of its ultimate objectives. Moscow remained unconquered, Leningrad endured its siege, and the Red Army, though battered and bloodied, had not collapsed as the German High Command had predicted. The initial strategy of a swift knockout blow had failed, leaving the Wehrmacht committed to a grinding war of attrition across a front that stretched over 1,000 miles. It was against this backdrop that Hitler conceived his most fateful gamble. The Führer's new plan was bold, yet divided in its ambitions. Operation Blue, launched in June 1942, aimed to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus, those precious wells that pumped the lifeblood of modern warfare. Control of this petroleum would fuel the German war machine, while simultaneously strangling the Soviet economy. It was a sound strategic objective, one that his generals understood and supported. But Hitler, never content with single objectives, expanded the mission in ways that would prove catastrophic. On the 23rd of July, 1942, the Nazi leader issued a directive that would echo through history. Not only would Army Group South drive toward the oil fields, but a significant portion of their strength would be diverted to capture Stalingrad, a major industrial city sprawling along the banks of the Volga River. His generals were stunned. Against all military wisdom, Hitler was splitting his forces between two distant objectives, weakening both thrusts in pursuit of what many saw as unnecessary conquest. The city itself was a prize worth taking. Stalingrad stretched nearly 30 miles along the Volga's western bank, its factories churning out tanks, tractors, and armaments for the Soviet war effort. Capturing it would sever vital transportation links between northern and southern Russia, cutting the flow of oil, grain, and supplies that fed the Red Army. From a strategic standpoint, the city's fall would anchor the northern flank of the German advance into the Caucasus, protecting the main drive toward the oil fields. But for Hitler, strategy was only part of the equation. The city bore the name of Joseph Stalin, his ideological nemesis, and the man who had transformed the Soviet Union into a communist superpower. Taking Stalingrad would be more than a military victory. It would be personal triumph, a propaganda coup that would humiliate the Soviet leader and demonstrate German supremacy to the world. This obsession with symbolism would prove to be Hitler's fatal flaw. The German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, was chosen to spearhead the assault on Stalingrad. Paulus was a capable officer, methodical and precise, but he was also a man who followed orders without question. When Hitler commanded him to take the city, Paulus began his preparations with typical German efficiency. What he could not have foreseen was that he was marching his army toward the most savage urban battle in military history. As summer blazed across the Russian steppes, the German war machine rolled eastward with terrifying momentum. Panzer divisions carved through Soviet defenses like knives through paper, their tanks raising dust clouds that could be seen for miles. Infantry divisions followed in their wake, consolidating gains and preparing for the next phase of the assault. The Red Army seemed to be in full retreat, abandoning vast territories as they fell back toward the Volga. By August, German spearheads had reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. The city lay spread before them like an industrial maze, its smokestacks reaching toward the sky, its factories still producing weapons even as shells began to fall among them. Soviet resistance was fierce, but seemed futile against the overwhelming German advantages in equipment, training, and tactical experience. Yet something was different about this battle from the very beginning. The man chosen to defend Stalingrad was General Vasily Chuikov, a tough, battle-hardened veteran who understood that conventional tactics would mean certain defeat. Chuikov made a decision that would transform the nature of the entire campaign. Rather than fighting the Germans in open battle where their superior firepower and mobility would dominate, he would drag them into the city itself, into the rubble and ruins where those advantages would count for nothing. On the 23rd of August, the German 14th Panzer Corps smashed through the northern suburbs of Stalingrad, their tanks reaching the western bank of the Volga River that same evening. It seemed as though the city would fall within days, just another conquest in the long march of German victories. But as the panzers rolled through the streets, they encountered something new and terrifying. The Soviets were not retreating. Instead, they would transform of rubble into a fortress.ng. Every building, every basement, every pile. What followed was unlike any battle the Wehrmacht had ever fought. The Germans, accustomed to sweeping maneuvers across open terrain, found themselves trapped in a nightmare of close-quarters combat. Buildings changed hands multiple times in a single day. Soldiers fought room by room, floor by floor, sometimes with the enemy occupying the basement while they held the upper stories. Snipers lurked in every shadow, turning routine movements into deadly gambles. The German soldiers had a name for this new form of warfare. They called it the Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. It was a fitting description for combat that had descended into the sewers and basements of the city, where men fought like cornered animals in a maze of destruction. The very rubble created by German bombardment became obstacles that favored the defenders, providing cover and concealment that neutralized German technological superiority. As September turned to October, the battle settled into a grinding stalemate that consumed men and material at an appalling rate. The German Sixth Army, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, found itself locked in a death struggle that seemed to have no end. Every day brought new casualties, new horrors, and ever-diminishing hopes of victory. The city that was supposed to fall in days had become a meat grinder that was devouring an entire German army. Yet even as his forces bled themselves white in the ruins of Stalingrad, Hitler refused to consider withdrawal. The city had become an obsession that clouded his strategic judgment. He poured reinforcements into the battle, feeding fresh divisions into the urban nightmare rather than admitting that his gamble had failed. What he did not realize was that far to the north and south, Soviet commanders were preparing a counterstroke that would trap his entire army in a web of steel and fire. The autumn of 1942 brought with it more than just the changing seasons. As October winds howled through the skeletal remains of Stalingrad's buildings, a new phase of the battle was beginning to take shape. The German Sixth Army, once numbering over 250,000 men, had been reduced to exhausted remnants clinging to fragments of a city they could neither fully conquer nor abandon. General Paulus found himself trapped not just by Soviet resistance, but by Hitler's increasingly desperate orders to hold every inch of ground at any cost. Within the ruins, life had taken on a surreal quality that defied human comprehension. German soldiers wrote letters home describing a world turned upside down, where the dead outnumbered the living and survival was measured in hours rather than days. One lieutenant scrawled in his diary that Stalingrad was no longer a city but a furnace of burning stone, where even the rats had fled in terror. The streets echoed with the constant crack of sniper fire and the rumble of collapsing buildings, creating a symphony of destruction that never ceased. The Red Army defenders under Chuikov had embraced this hellish environment, turning every pile of rubble into a strongpoint and every basement into a bunker. They developed new tactics, born from desperation and refined through blood. Small assault groups moved through the sewers and tunnels beneath the city, emerging behind German lines to strike and vanish like phantoms. Soviet soldiers learned to fight with knives and grenades in spaces so cramped that rifles were useless, engaging in combat so intimate and brutal that it scarred the survivors for life. As the battle raged block by block, something extraordinary was happening beyond the immediate vicinity of Stalingrad. Soviet commanders, led by the brilliant Georgy Zhukov, were orchestrating one of the most ambitious military operations in history. While Hitler remained fixated on the propaganda value of capturing Stalin's namesake city, the Red Army was preparing to spring a trap that would engulf not just the Sixth Army, but hundreds of thousands of Axis troops spread across the southern front. The genius of what became known as Operation Uranus lay not in its complexity, but in its simplicity. Rather than attempting to break the German stranglehold on Stalingrad through direct assault, Soviet planners identified the fundamental weakness in Hitler's strategy. The German forces were stretched across an impossibly wide front, with their flanks protected not by elite Wehrmacht units, but by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian armies that were poorly equipped, undermanned, and increasingly demoralized. Throughout October and November, as the world's attention remained focused on the savage fighting in Stalingrad's ruins, the Soviets were quietly massing over 1 million men, 900 tanks, and 1,400 aircraft in positions north and south of the city. The scale of the build-up was unprecedented, yet German intelligence failed to grasp its significance. Hitler and his staff, mesmerized by their own propaganda about Slavic inferiority, convinced themselves that the Soviets lacked the capability to mount such an operation. The irony was profound. While German soldiers died by the thousands fighting for individual buildings in Stalingrad, the Red Army was preparing to demonstrate that they had learned the lessons of modern warfare better than their teachers. The massive Soviet buildup was hidden behind elaborate deception operations that convinced German reconnaissance that they faced only defensive preparations. Meanwhile, fresh divisions moved into position under cover of darkness, their approach masked by the sounds of battle echoing from the burning city. On the morning of the 19th of November, 1942, the temperature had dropped well below freezing across the Russian steppes. Fog hung low over the Don River, reducing visibility to mere yards. It was perfect weather for what was about to unfold. At precisely 7:30 in the morning, the silence was shattered by the largest artillery barrage the Eastern Front had yet witnessed. Over 3,000 Soviet guns opened fire simultaneously, their shells screaming across the grey morning sky to crash down upon the Romanian Third Army, holding the northwestern approaches to Stalingrad. The Romanian defenders, already weakened by months of attrition and increasingly aware that they were fighting in a war that was not truly their own, broke under the tremendous bombardment. Entire regiments simply ceased to exist, vaporized by the concentrated firepower or scattered to the winds in panic. Within hours, Soviet tank columns were pouring through gaps in the line that stretched for miles, racing across the open steppes toward objectives deep in the German rear. 50 miles to the south of Stalingrad, a second hammer blow fell with equal devastation. The Romanian Fourth Army, already thinly spread across an impossibly wide front, found itself under assault by fresh Soviet divisions that attacked with a ferocity born of 2 years of suffering under German occupation. Here, too, the defensive line crumbled like sand, allowing Red Army mechanized corps to begin their own race toward the west. The German High Command was slow to grasp the magnitude of what was unfolding. Initial reports spoke of limited Soviet attacks, the kind of probing assaults that had become routine along the Eastern Front. But as the morning progressed and communication with entire Romanian divisions was lost, the true scope of the disaster began to emerge. This was not a tactical probe or a diversionary attack. This was the beginning of a massive encirclement operation that threatened to trap the entire German Sixth Army. General Paulus, locked in combat within Stalingrad itself, was among the last to understand the implications of the Soviet offensive. His attention remained focused on the immediate tactical situation, where his men were still fighting for control of individual factories and apartment blocks. The reports of enemy breakthroughs seemed distant and unrelated to his primary mission of capturing the city. It would be several crucial hours before he realized that the battle for Stalingrad had suddenly become a battle for the survival of his entire army. By the 21st of November, the two arms of the Soviet pincer were racing toward each other across the winter landscape, leaving chaos in their wake. German supply columns, caught in the open by advancing Soviet tank units, were destroyed or scattered. Airfields fell without warning, their surprised defenders overwhelmed before they could organize effective resistance. Communication networks collapsed as command posts were overrun and radio stations went silent. The psychological impact on German forces was as devastating as the physical destruction. For over a year, the Wehrmacht had advanced steadily eastward, conquering territory and defeating Soviet armies with what seemed like mechanical precision. The idea that the Red Army could mount such a sophisticated and successful counteroffensive challenged everything German soldiers believed about their own superiority and their enemy's capabilities. On the 23rd of November, the inevitable occurred. Soviet spearheads from the northern and southern attacks linked up near the town of Kalach, 60 miles west of Stalingrad. The trap was closed. Over 200,000 German and Axis soldiers, including the entire 6th Army and elements of the 4th Panzer Army, were now surrounded in what the Germans would come to call the Kessel, the cauldron. What had begun as Hitler's bid for personal glory had become the greatest military disaster in German history. The enormity of the disaster was not immediately apparent to those trapped within the shrinking pocket. German soldiers, accustomed to fluid warfare where temporary NC quickly broken by relief encirclements were forces, initially viewed their situation as a temporary setback. Many believed that Army Group Don, under the command of Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, would punch through Soviet lines within days. After all, this was the Wehrmacht, the army that had conquered Europe. Surely they would not be abandoned in this frozen wasteland. Hitler, however, had other plans. When Paulus radioed for permission to break out of the encirclement, while his forces still retained some mobility and strength, the Führer's response was swift and uncompromising. The 6th Army would hold its positions to the last man and the last round. Stalingrad would be held at all costs, supplied by air until relieving forces could break the Soviet ring. D/2. It was a decision that condemned 100,000 men to a fate worse than death. The man tasked with the impossible mission of supplying the trapped army was Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, whose Luftwaffe had already been stretched thin across multiple fronts. With characteristic bluster, Göring assured Hitler that his aircraft could deliver the 750 tons of supplies needed daily to sustain the 6th Army. It was a promise built on fantasy rather than reality, one that would prove catastrophically false. The airlift began in late November, under conditions that would have challenged even a well-equipped and experienced air force. Soviet fighters prowled the skies around the shrinking perimeter, shooting down German transport planes with increasing frequency. Anti-aircraft guns ringed every potential landing strip, turning supply runs into deadly gauntlets. Weather conditions grew progressively worse as winter tightened its grip on the steppes, grounding aircraft for days at a time. Even when supply flights managed to reach the pocket, the tonnage delivered fell far short of what was needed. On good days, the Luftwaffe might manage to deliver 100 tons of supplies. More often, the figure dropped to 50 tons or less. Men who had once enjoyed the finest rations in the German army found themselves fighting over scraps of moldy bread and thin gruel made from whatever could be found. As December arrived with howling winds and temperatures that plunged far below zero, the true horror of the Kessel began to manifest. Soldiers who had conquered half of Europe now huddled in improvised shelters, burning furniture and books to ward off frostbite. The wounded filled makeshift hospitals where surgery was performed without anesthetic, and amputations became routine as gangrene claimed frozen limbs. The dead accumulated faster than they could be buried in ground, frozen harder than concrete. Medical supplies vanished entirely by mid-December. Soldiers with minor wounds died from infections that would have been easily treatable just months before. Typhus and dysentery spread through the ranks, turning strong men into walking skeletons. The psychological toll was perhaps even worse than the physical suffering, as proud German soldiers watched their comrades waste away while their leaders in Berlin spoke of glorious sacrifice and final victory. General Paulus found himself caught between impossible orders from above and the desperate reality of his dying army. A methodical man who had built his career on following precise instructions, he struggled to reconcile Hitler's demands for continued resistance with the mathematical certainty that his forces could not survive much longer. Radio messages from the pocket grew increasingly desperate, pleading for permission to attempt a breakout, while some semblance of fighting strength remained. The response from Berlin was always the same. Hold fast, relief is coming. The 6th Army's sacrifice was buying precious time for the Reich to reorganize its defenses. These messages, transmitted over increasingly weak radio signals, became a cruel mockery to men who were dying of hunger and cold, in numbers that defied comprehension. By Christmas 1942, the Sixth Army existed more as a military fiction than as a fighting force. On the 24th of December, Soviet forces captured Tatsinskaya airfield, one of the primary bases supporting the airlift. The loss forced German transport aircraft to operate from even more distant bases, further reducing the already inadequate supply deliveries. It was a crushing blow that effectively ended any hope of sustaining the trapped army through aerial resupply. Yet still the orders from Berlin demanded that every position be held. Field Marshal von Manstein's relief attempt, codenamed Operation Winter Storm, launched on the 12th of December with the 4th Panzer Army driving northeast toward the trapped garrison. For a brief moment, hope flickered within the Kessel as radio reports spoke of German armor advancing steadily toward their positions. Paulus was ordered to prepare for Operation Thunderclap, a coordinated breakout that would link his forces with Manstein's relief column. The attack came agonizingly close to success. By the 19th of December, advance elements of the 4th Panzer Army had reached positions just 30 miles from the southern edge of the pocket. Some of Paulus's units could actually hear the sound of Manstein's guns echoing across the frozen landscape. Victory seemed within reach, requiring only the courage to abandon fixed positions and fight through to freedom. But Hitler's obsession with holding ground proved stronger than military logic. Rather than authorizing the breakout that might have saved much of the Sixth Army, the Führer insisted that any relief operation must reach the current German positions in Stalingrad, be abandoned. The pocket would not impossible demand Forstein to attack, prepared manned Soviet defenses with insufficient forces, bleeding his relief columns white against determined resistance. Soviet commanders, fully aware of the German relief attempt, had prepared their own response. Fresh divisions were rushed south to block Manstein's advance, while other forces prepared to crush the trapped garrison before it could be rescued. The race between German relief and Soviet annihilation would determine the fate of hundreds of thousands of men locked in their frozen hell. As 1942 drew to its close, the men of the Sixth Army faced a new year that many would not live to see. Rations had been cut to starvation levels, with soldiers receiving perhaps by whatever a few ounces of bread per day supplement could scavenge from the ruins around them. Horses, dogs, cats and rats became sources of precious protein for men whose bodies were consuming their own muscle mass to wounded, stumbled through snow-covered streets like survive. The walking, living ghosts, their hollow eyes reflecting the knowledge that death was merely a matter of time. Some embraced that fate with grim resignation, writing final letters home that would never be delivered. Others clung to desperate hope, believing against all evidence that rescue would come before it was too late. All of them had become unwitting participants in one of history's greatest military catastrophes, trapped by one man's refusal to admit his mistake. In bunkers and basements scattered throughout the ruins of Stalingrad, German officers maintained the pretense of military discipline even as their world collapsed around them. Orders were still issued, reports still filed, and military courtesy still observed, as if these rituals could somehow restore meaning to their was a testament to the power of military increasingly meaningless situation. It culture, but also a tragic illustration of how deeply ingrained habits could persist even in the face of obvious futility. The Soviet forces surrounding the pocket showed no mercy to their trapped enemies. Artillery bombardments continued around the clock, targeting any sign of German resistance or movement. Snipers picked off individual soldiers who exposed themselves for even a moment, while assault teams probed constantly for weak points in the shrinking perimeter. The noose was tightening with methodical precision, squeezing the life from what remained of Hitler's once mighty army. As January 1943 dawned over the frozen wasteland that had once been the pride of the German war machine, Field Marshal von Manstein made one final desperate gamble to reach his trapped comrades. Operation Winter Storm had stalled just miles from salvation, its spearheads blunted by fierce Soviet resistance and Hitler's impossible demands. The window for rescue was closing rapidly, measured now in hours rather than days. Within the shrinking pocket, the pretense of military order was finally beginning to crack under the weight of unimaginable suffering. Soldiers who had once marched in perfect formation through the streets of conquered capitals now stumbled through knee-deep snow, their uniforms hanging like rags on skeletal frames. The proud Wehrmacht, terror of Europe, had been reduced to a collection of starving ghosts haunting the ruins of their own ambitions. General Paulus, his face gaunt and his once immaculate uniform now stained and threadbare, faced the most agonizing decision of his military career. His radio crackled with increasingly frantic messages from Berlin, each one demanding continued resistance in the name of German honor. Yet before his eyes lay the undeniable evidence that his army was dying not from enemy bullets, but from neglect and impossible orders from men who had never felt the bite of Russian winter. On the 31st of January 1943, as Soviet tanks rolled through the rubble-strewn streets toward his final bunker, Field Marshal Paulus made the choice that Hitler had forbidden. He surrendered. With him fell the last remnants of an army that had once seemed invincible, sealing the fate of the Third Reich. Of the 91,000 German soldiers who marched into Soviet captivity that frozen morning, fewer than 6,000 would ever see their homeland again. The rest would perish in prison camps, their bones scattered across the vastness of Siberia. Hitler's obsession with a city that bore his enemy's name had cost him not just an army, but the war itself. Stalingrad marked the moment when the tide turned irrevocably against the Axis powers. Never again would German forces enjoy the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. From the ruins of this single city, the Red Army would begin its inexorable march toward Berlin, driving before it the shattered remnants of Hitler's thousand-year Reich. The lesson of Stalingrad echoes through history with terrible clarity. Hubris and ideology, when allowed to override military wisdom, do not merely lose battles, they destroy empires. In the end, Hitler's greatest victory became his most catastrophic defeat, and the city that was meant to immortalize his triumph became instead the graveyard of his dreams.